Life has a funny way of changing when you least expect it. Looking back now, I wish I had paid more attention to the little signs, the subtle shifts that would eventually turn our world upside down. But that's the thing about change. It often sneaks up on you, wearing the mask of ordinary days. My husband and I had been married for 15 wonderful years. We weren't perfect, but we were happy in our own little bubble. Our routines were comfortable: morning coffee together, silly jokes over dinner, and weekend movie marathons with too much popcorn. He was my best friend, my partner in crime, the person who knew exactly how to make me laugh, even on my worst days. Everything started changing one regular Tuesday evening. He came home from work different somehow. There was this spark in his eyes I hadn't seen before. At first, I thought maybe he got a promotion or closed a big deal at work. But no, it was something else entirely. "You won't believe what happened today," he said, barely taking off his shoes before launching into his story. His coworker had invited him to this new church that had recently opened in our town, the Garden of Divine Truth. Now, you have to understand, we weren't particularly religious people. Sure, we celebrated Christmas and Easter like everyone else, but that was about it. Religion was never really our thing. But the way he described this place, it wasn't like any church I'd heard of before. The building itself was this modern masterpiece of glass and steel, standing out among our town's traditional brick buildings like a crystal growing from concrete. People couldn't stop talking about it. At the grocery store, at the coffee shop, everywhere I went, I heard whispers about this mysterious new addition to our community. That weekend, he attended his first service. I remember watching him get ready that Sunday morning, taking extra care with his appearance, almost like he was going to a job interview. "You sure you don't want to come?" he asked, adjusting his tie in the mirror. I declined, using the excuse of catching up on laundry. In reality, something about the whole situation made me uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. When he came back that afternoon, he was different. Not in any dramatic way, but there was something in his expression, in the way he carried himself. He spent hours telling me about the service, about the charismatic church leader they called Teacher Chen, about the beautiful music and the feeling of community. His eyes lit up as he described the meditation sessions and the promises of finding inner peace and purpose. Over the next few weeks, one service turned into 2, then 3. He started attending evening study groups and weekend workshops. Our usual Sunday brunches became solo meals for me. I told myself it was good that he'd found something meaningful, something that made him happy. After all, isn't that what we want for the people we love? But late at night, when he was engrossed in those strange religious texts that had started appearing around our house, I would catch myself staring at him, trying to recognize the man I'd married in this newer, more enlightened version of my husband. The changes were subtle but undeniable: the way he talked, the way he dressed, even the foods he ate. It was like watching someone slowly transform into a different person, one small change at a time. I remember the moment I first felt truly worried. We were having dinner one evening, and he mentioned an upcoming special service. "Teacher Chen says it's going to be life-changing," he said, his voice filled with an enthusiasm that felt almost desperate. "He's going to reveal some ancient wisdom that's been hidden for centuries." Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just excitement, it was something closer to obsession. But when I tried to express my concerns, he brushed them off with practiced phrases that sounded rehearsed, as if someone else had put the words in his mouth. That night, as I lay awake listening to him mumble prayers in his sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The Garden of Divine Truth was planting its seeds in our life, and I had no idea what kind of fruits it would bear. Little did I know then, but that ordinary Tuesday evening was the last normal day of our marriage. Everything that came after would test our love, our trust, and our very understanding of reality in ways I never could have imagined. But that's the thing about life-changing moments. They rarely announce themselves. They simply arrived, disguised as ordinary days, and before you know it, nothing is ever the same again. They say if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump right out, but if you put it in cool water and slowly heat it up, it won't notice until it's too late. That's exactly how the changes in my husband happened, so gradually that at first, I barely noticed them. But looking back now, every small change was like another degree of heat being added to our lives. It started with his morning routine. My husband had always been a hit the snooze button 5 times kind of person, but suddenly he was waking up at 5 a.m. every day. I'd find him sitting cross-legged on our living room floor, eyes closed, breathing deeply in what he called his morning meditation. The first few times I tried to join him, but he said I was disrupting his spiritual energy. Our kitchen started looking different too. One day, I opened our cabinet to grab some coffee and instead found rows of herbal teas with names I couldn't pronounce. The coffee maker, our faithful morning companion for 15 years, had been unplugged and tucked away. Teacher Chen says stimulants block our connection to the divine, he explained when I asked about it. I noticed he said, Teacher Chen says, a lot these days. The changes kept coming, each one small enough on its own, but adding up to something bigger. Our Friday night takeout tradition disappeared because the food wasn't pure enough. The television in our bedroom vanished because it carried negative energies. Even our comfortable old couch was replaced with firm meditation cushions that hurt my back just looking at them. But it wasn't just the physical changes in our home that worried me. It was the way he started talking, using words that didn't sound like him at all. I'm working on elevating my consciousness, he'd say, or I'm trying to align my chakras with the universal truth. My husband, who used to roll his eyes at anything remotely spiritual, was now talking about energy fields and astral planes like he was reading from a script. Our friends started noticing too. When we met our longtime neighbors for dinner, something that became increasingly rare, my husband spent the entire evening trying to recruit them to attend a service. He pulled out his phone to show them videos of Teacher Chen's sermons, barely touching his food. I watched our friends exchange worried glances, and I felt my face grow hot with embarrassment. The worst part was how he started viewing our past together. One night, I pulled out our old photo albums, hoping to remind him of the fun times we'd had. But instead of smiling at the memories, he shook his head. We were so lost then, he said, living in spiritual darkness. 15 years of love and laughter reduced to spiritual darkness. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. Our bedroom, once a place of comfort and connection, became strangely sterile. He replaced our colorful bedding with plain white sheets because they were more pure. The photos on our walls came down, replaced by strange symbols he'd learned about at the church. Even our intimate moments became different. He'd stopped to pray before and after, making me feel like an afterthought in my own marriage. The money changes started small too. First, it was just a few dollars in the collection plate. Then it was special books and meditation cushions. Soon, he was signing up for expensive weekend retreats and spiritual advancement courses. When I tried to discuss our budget, he'd get this distant look in his eyes and say things like, material concerns shouldn't limit spiritual growth. But what scared me most was the growing emptiness in our home. The silence where our laughter used to be. The space between us at dinner, filled with nothing but the sound of forks against plates. Even when he was physically present, his mind was elsewhere, probably back at that church, with its gleaming walls and mysterious teachings. One evening, I found him staring at our wedding photo with a strange expression. You know, he said softly, Teacher Chen says that sometimes people need to leave behind their earthly attachments to reach higher consciousness. The way he looked at that photo, at our younger, happier selves, made my blood run cold. It was like he was already saying goodbye to who we used to be. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him, to scream, "Wake up! This isn't you." But I knew that would only push him further away. Instead, I watched and waited, gathering my worry like stones in my pocket, wondering how many more I could carry before I sank under their weight. Our house, once filled with the comfortable chaos of a shared life, was becoming as sterile and cold as that glass church on the hill. And somewhere in all these changes, I was losing not just my husband, but the very foundation of our life together. The scariest part. This was only the beginning. Have you ever felt completely alone while sitting right next to someone you love? That's what my life had become 3 months into my husband's involvement with the Garden of Divine Truth. The physical distance between us on our couch might have been just a few inches, but emotionally, we were worlds apart. I remember one particular evening that really showed me how much things had changed. I'd made his favorite dinner, the spicy noodle dish that used to make his eyes light up. He barely touched it. I'm fasting for spiritual clarity, he said, pushing away the plate I'd spent an hour preparing. Teacher Chen says we should focus on feeding our souls, not our bodies. The thing is, it wasn't just about the food. It was about all the little moments we used to share. Remember how I mentioned our Friday date nights? We'd kept that tradition alive through job changes, family crises, even that terrible year when we were both working overtime to pay off our house. But now, he spent every Friday evening at church study sessions. One Friday, I decided to surprise him at the church, thinking maybe I could understand this new world that had captivated him. The building was even more imposing up close, all glass and sharp angles reaching toward the sky. I found him in a small group, nodding along as they discussed something called spiritual purification. When he saw me, there was no warmth in his eyes, no hint of the man who used to light up whenever I entered a room. Instead, he looked embarrassed, like I was intruding on something private. The way he spoke changed too. Every conversation somehow turned into a lecture about spiritual enlightenment. If I talked about work stress, he'd say I needed to transcend worldly concerns. If I mentioned missing our old friends, he'd call them low-vibration individuals. It was like talking to a walking self-help book, all empty phrases and rehearsed wisdom. Even my clothes became a problem. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, he frowned at my regular office outfit, a simple blouse and skirt I'd worn dozens of times before. "Your clothing choices reflect spiritual impurity," he said, in that new, detached voice of his. Teacher Chen says modest dress shows respect for divine energy. I ended up crying in the bathroom, not because of what he said, but because I couldn't recognize the person who said it. Our phones became another battleground. He'd constantly send me links to the church's videos and articles, then get upset when I didn't watch them immediately. Meanwhile, my messages to him often went unanswered for hours, sometimes days. I was in deep meditation, he'd explain, or I was attending an important spiritual guidance session. The man who used to send me funny memes throughout the day now only communicated through forwarded quotes about enlightenment. The hardest part was bedtime. We used to love our evening routine, sharing stories about our day, making plans for the weekend, sometimes just lying there holding hands. Now he spent hours reading those strange religious texts, muttering prayers under his breath. If I tried to start a conversation, he'd say, "This is my sacred study time." The warm, comforting presence I'd fallen asleep next to for 15 years was replaced by a stranger who felt cold and unreachable. One night, I woke up to find his side of the bed empty. I found him in our spare room, surrounded by candles, staring at a photo of Teacher Chen. The way he looked at that picture, with more love and devotion than he'd shown me in months, broke something inside me. I stood there in the doorway, watching my husband worship a stranger's image, and felt the last threads of our connection starting to unravel. Our home, once filled with the comfortable sounds of a shared life, laughing at TV shows, debating what to have for dinner, planning our next vacation, fell into an eerie silence. The only sounds now were his whispered prayers and the rustle of pages as he pored over yet another church manuscript. The worst moments were when I caught glimpses of my old husband, like when he'd accidentally laugh at something funny before catching himself and returning to his serious, spiritual demeanor. Or when he'd instinctively reach for my hand before remembering that physical touch was now reserved for ritual greetings with church members. Looking at our wedding photo on the wall, I couldn't help but wonder, how do you bridge a gap that grows wider every day? How do you reach someone who's physically present, but mentally and emotionally somewhere else entirely? As I watched him pack his bag for yet another weekend retreat, I realized with a sinking heart that this emotional distance was just the beginning of an even bigger storm heading our way. You know that feeling when something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on what? That's how I felt the first time my husband invited church members into our home. It was supposed to be a simple dinner gathering, but looking back, I realized it was the moment everything started falling into place, and not in a good way. They arrived exactly at 7 p.m., 5 of them, all wearing similar plain white clothing. The woman who seemed to be their leader introduced herself as the Inner Light Guide. The others didn't give names, just titles like Seeker of Truth or Vessel of Wisdom. There was something off about their smiles, too perfect, too practiced, like masks they'd carefully learned to wear. Our living room, which had hosted countless casual gatherings with friends over the years, felt different that evening. They sat with perfect posture on our meditation cushions, the ones that had replaced our comfy couch, speaking in soft, measured tones. Every few minutes, they'd quote Teacher Chen, looking at my husband for approval, and he'd beam at them like a student who'd just given the right answer. The conversation was strange, to say the least. When I mentioned my sister's upcoming visit, the inner light guide touched my hand and said, "Outside connections can taint the path to enlightenment." The way she said it, so gentle yet so firm, sent chills down my spine. I noticed my husband nodding along, as if this made perfect sense. They talked about an upcoming spiritual retreat called the Ascension Journey. The way they described it made it sound like the most important event in human history. Only the chosen ones will receive the full revelation, they said, their eyes shining with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The retreat wasn't cheap. They mentioned a spiritual investment of several $1,000s. I watched my husband's face light up with interest, and my stomach turned. But what really got to me was how they spoke about the outside world. Everything was divided into pure and impure influences. My husband's job? Impure, but necessary for now. Our neighbors? Impure. My friends? Definitely impure. The only pure things were the church, Teacher Chen, and their teachings. They even had an answer for why the newspaper had written a questioning article about their church. The impure always fear the light of truth. During dinner, a bland, vegetarian meal they had insisted on bringing, they started talking about other church members I recognized from our community. A local business owner who'd recently joined had seen the light and was now dedicating his resources to the cause. The retired teacher who joined last month had freed herself from earthly attachments by selling her house and moving into church housing. The scariest part? My husband was drinking in every word. He sat there, notebook in hand, writing down their teachings like they were revealing the secrets of the universe. This man, who used to be the first to spot nonsense, who'd roll his eyes at TV preachers, was now hanging on every word from people who wouldn't even share their real names. After they left, our house smelled of their strange incense, and my husband was practically floating. "Wasn't that amazing?" he kept saying. "Did you feel the spiritual energy?" All I felt was dread, especially when he mentioned that they'd be coming back every week for home enlightenment sessions. These weekly sessions became the new normal. Each time, they'd bring new teachings and make new demands. They encouraged my husband to spend more time at the church, to attend more workshops, to invest more in his spiritual growth. They always had a reason why he needed to sign up for another course or attend another retreat. I started noticing how they'd strategically isolate him. If he mentioned a work friend, they'd find a way to suggest that friend was holding back his spiritual progress. When he talked about his childhood best friend, they pointed out how that friend's negative energy was probably the reason for my husband's headaches, which he'd never had before joining the church. The changes in our home became more dramatic. They convinced him to take down family photos because past attachments block future enlightenment. They suggested rearranging furniture according to spiritual energy flows. They even had opinions about which directions our beds should face and what colors were spiritually appropriate for our walls. One evening, after another of these sessions, I found a pamphlet they'd left behind. It detailed the levels of spiritual advancement in their organization, each with its own required investment and commitments. As I read through it, my blood ran cold. This wasn't just about spiritual guidance anymore. This was about control, about slowly taking over every aspect of a person's life. Looking at my husband that night, excitedly planning the next church event in his journal, I realized we were in deeper trouble than I'd thought. These people weren't just changing his beliefs. They were systematically dismantling his entire world, replacing everything and everyone he loved with their own version of reality. And I had no idea how to stop it. They say truth finds its way to the surface, like a bubble rising through water. For me, that moment of truth came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the most unexpected way. I was at the grocery store, picking up ingredients for dinner, when I overheard two women talking in hushed voices about the Garden of Divine Truth. What caught my attention wasn't what they were saying, but the fear in their voices. "Did you hear about the old bookstore owner?" one whispered. "Sold his shop of 30 years and gave everything to that church." The other woman nodded, adding, "My cousin's friend lost her whole retirement fund to them." They convinced her it was for some special spiritual investment program. I stood there, frozen, a can of soup forgotten in my hand. These weren't just rumors or gossip, there was real pain in their voices. That evening, instead of cooking dinner, I sat down at my computer and started digging. What I found made my heart sink to my stomach. The Garden of Divine Truth wasn't new at all. They'd just changed their name. In other cities, they'd been known by different names: the Temple of Eternal Wisdom, the Sanctuary of Divine Light, the Path of Pure Truth. Each time, the pattern was the same. They'd appear suddenly, grow quickly, and leave a trail of broken families and empty bank accounts behind. I found an online support group for families affected by the church. Reading their stories was like looking into a mirror of my own life. The early morning meditations, the changing diets, the isolation from friends and family, it was all part of their playbook. One post particularly caught my eye. A woman described how her husband had emptied their children's college funds for what the church called spiritual advancement fees. With shaking hands, I checked our joint bank account. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the transactions. Weekly donations that had grown from small amounts to hundreds of dollars, special retreat fees, required reading materials, spiritual counseling sessions. In just a few months, my husband had transferred over $30,000 to various church-related accounts. I reached out to some former members through the support group. Their stories poured out like water from a broken dam. One man had been a high-ranking member for 3 years before breaking free. He told me about the church's inner workings, how they targeted successful professionals, how they used sleep deprivation and dietary restrictions to make people more suggestible, how they turned families against each other. Watch out for the special retreats, he warned me. That's where they really sink their hooks in. They keep you up for days with minimal food, bombard you with teachings, and make you feel like you're having spiritual experiences. But it's all carefully orchestrated manipulation. Another former member, a retired teacher, shared how they used people's personal information against them. Everything shared in confidential spiritual counseling sessions was documented and used to control members later. They knew everyone's weaknesses, fears, and secrets. The deeper I dug, the worse it got. I found old newspaper articles about Teacher Chen from his days in other cities. He wasn't even a religious leader originally. He'd been a failed real estate agent who discovered that starting a church was more profitable than selling houses. The ancient wisdom he claimed to teach was cobbled together from various self-help books and internet sources. Their financial structure was like a pyramid scheme dressed up in spiritual clothing. Members were pressured to recruit others with promises of advancing to higher spiritual levels. Each level required more money, more commitment, and more isolation from the outside world. Those who questioned anything were labeled as spiritually resistant and pressured to prove their dedication through larger donations. I discovered that the church bought properties through a maze of shell companies. They'd pressure wealthy members to donate their homes or businesses, promising spiritual rewards in return. In 3 different cities, they'd left elderly members virtually homeless after convincing them to sign over their properties. The most heartbreaking discovery was their impact on families. I found dozens of stories of marriages destroyed, children cut off from parents, siblings turned against each other. They had a special knack for identifying people at vulnerable points in their lives, after a loss, during a career change, or in the midst of a personal crisis. One night, while my husband was at another church meeting, I found his journal hidden in his desk drawer. Reading it felt like a violation of privacy, but I was desperate to understand what was happening to him. The entry started normally enough, but gradually changed. The later pages were filled with strange symbols, repeated phrases, and detailed notes about other members' spiritual progress. There were lists of people he needed to help free from negative influences, including my name at the top. The final piece clicked when I discovered a private online forum for current members. Someone had shared their login details with the support group. Reading through the posts made my blood run cold. Church leaders openly discussed manipulation techniques, calling them spiritual guidance strategies. They shared tips on how to pressure members to increase donations, how to isolate them from family, and how to handle those who started asking questions. Sitting there in my dark home office, surrounded by evidence of this massive deception, I felt like I was drowning. The church hadn't just taken our money, they were systematically dismantling my husband's identity, replacing it with their own creation. And the worst part, according to the patterns I'd uncovered, this was just the beginning. The biggest demands, the complete isolation, the total financial surrender, all of that was yet to come. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we have with people we love most. After discovering the truth about the Garden of Divine Truth, I spent 3 days preparing myself for what I knew would be the most important talk of our marriage. I practiced what I'd say in front of the mirror, rehearsed every possible response, and tried to find the gentlest way to present the harsh truth. I chose a Sunday evening, after he returned from church. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of our kitchen clock, the same one we bought together at that little antique shop on our 5th anniversary. I had spread all my evidence on the dining table, printouts of newspaper articles, financial statements, testimonies from former members, everything I'd discovered. "We need to talk," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite my racing heart. He looked up from his church materials, that now familiar distant look in his eyes. "Can it wait?" "I need to prepare for tomorrow's spiritual advancement session." "No," I replied softly, "it can't wait anymore." I pulled out a chair for him and gestured to the papers on the table. "Please just look at these. That's all I'm asking." At first, he refused to even glance at the documents. "This is negative energy," he said, using that rehearsed tone I'd grown to dread. "Teacher Chen warns us about those who try to lead us away from the path." "Teacher Chen," I said, picking up one of the articles, or should I say Mr. Lee, the former real estate agent who's been running similar schemes in 3 other states. That got his attention. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of my real husband behind those glazed eyes. I showed him the financial statements first. "Honey, look at these numbers. $30,000 in 3 months. Our savings, they're almost gone." His face tightened, but he looked. I saw his hands trembling slightly as he read through the transactions. "These are spiritual investments," he argued, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "They're for our eternal growth." I pulled out the testimonies from former members next. "Read this one," I said, pointing to a particularly detailed account. "This couple lost their home. And this family, their kids' college funds, everything. It's the same pattern, over and over." His face went through a range of emotions as he read: denial, anger, confusion, and then fear. "These could be fake," he said, but I could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. They could be created by negative forces trying to test our faith. Then I showed him the photos, Teacher Chen and his previous identities, the documentation of properties seized, the court records. "This isn't about faith," I said gently. "This is about money. They're using faith to take everything from people." That's when the anger erupted. He stood up so quickly his chair fell backward. "You don't understand," he shouted. "You're spiritually blind. You're stuck in material thinking." His voice was shaking, but I noticed he couldn't look directly at the evidence spread out before him. "Remember our first apartment?" I asked suddenly, changing tactics. "Remember how we saved for months to buy that awful green couch? Remember how we laughed when your mom visited and tried so hard to pretend she liked it?" He paused, caught off guard by the memory. For a moment, I saw confusion cross his face, like someone waking up from a deep sleep. "That's us," I continued softly. "That's real. Not these manufactured spiritual experiences they're selling you. Not these promises of enlightenment that come with price tags. But the peace I feel," he started, his voice uncertain. "The connection to something greater." I reached for his hand, and for the first time in months, he didn't pull away. "Those feelings are real," I said. "But they're coming from you, not them. They're taking your genuine spiritual seeking and using it to manipulate you." The next hour was intense. He moved between anger, denial, and moments of clarity. He accused me of trying to destroy his spiritual path, then broke down crying when I showed him how they'd used the same tactics on other families. He quoted Teacher Chen's teachings, then fell silent when I showed him where those same words had been copied from random self-help books. The hardest moment came when I pulled out his own journal. "I found this," I said quietly. "They've got you keeping tabs on other members, reporting back to them. That's not spirituality, that's control." He grabbed the journal and started flipping through it, his hands shaking. I could see him reading his own words with new eyes, seeing the gradual transformation from his normal writing to the strange, programmed responses they'd trained into him. "I don't," he started, then stopped. "I can't." He looked lost, like a child who'd just discovered Santa isn't real. The anger was gone now, replaced by something more vulnerable: fear, confusion, and the beginning of understanding. "I'm not asking you to stop believing in something greater," I said, taking his hand again. "I'm asking you to see what they're really doing. To you, to us, to everyone in that church." He sat down heavily, staring at the evidence spread across our dining table, the table where we'd shared thousands of meals, celebrated birthdays, made plans for our future. For the first time since this all began, I saw real doubt in his eyes. Not the manufactured doubt the church had trained him to reject, but genuine, personal doubt about what he'd gotten himself into. The clock kept ticking in our kitchen as we sat there in silence, the weight of truth settling around us like heavy snow. This wasn't the end of our struggle, not by a long shot, but it was a crack in the wall they'd built around his mind. And sometimes a crack is all you need to let the light in. They say the darkest hour comes just before dawn. For us, that darkest hour arrived during my husband's final retreat at the Garden of Divine Truth. Despite our confrontation and all the evidence I'd shown him, he insisted on attending one last time. "I need to see for myself," he said. "I need to know for sure." I spent that weekend pacing our house, jumping every time my phone buzzed. The support group members I'd connected with stayed in constant touch, reminding me that this was often the turning point, when people either fell deeper into the church's control or finally broke free. The retreat was supposed to be the church's biggest event yet. Teacher Chen had promised to reveal ancient secrets of spiritual mastery to his most dedicated followers. The cost? $5,000 per person, which my husband had already paid before our confrontation. What happened at that retreat wasn't what anyone expected. Maybe it was because my husband was finally watching with clear eyes, or maybe the church just got too confident. But everything fell apart in the most public way possible. It started with the miracle healing demonstration. Teacher Chen had promised to cure a longtime member's chronic illness through divine energy transmission. The whole thing was supposed to be the retreat's highlight. Instead, it became its undoing. My husband later told me how it happened. The sick member was supposed to be healed of their wheelchair-bound condition, but another participant recognized them as a perfectly healthy church staff member from another city. The whispers started spreading through the crowd. Then someone else recognized the wheelchair. It was the same one used in a similar miracle at another church location. The doubts that had been planted during our confrontation suddenly bloomed in my husband's mind. He started noticing other things too. How the spontaneous spiritual testimonies sounded rehearsed. How the voluntary donations were anything but voluntary. How people who asked questions were quickly hushed and led away. The breaking point came during a financial presentation. Teacher Chen was explaining the next level of spiritual investment needed for ultimate enlightenment, a mere $50,000 per person. My husband, sitting there with his newfound awareness, finally saw it for what it was: a fancy pyramid scheme dressed up in spiritual clothing. He walked out in the middle of the presentation, just stood up and walked straight to his car, ignoring the church members who tried to stop him. He drove home in complete silence, his mind racing with memories of all the red flags he'd ignored, all the warning signs he dismissed as negative thinking. When he walked through our front door that Sunday evening, he was a different person, not the blindly devoted church member of recent months, but not quite his old self either. He was quiet, shaken, but there was a clarity in his eyes I hadn't seen in months. "You were right," were his first words to me. About everything. Then he broke down crying, really crying, not the performative spiritual tears the church had taught him. I held him as years of normal human emotions came flooding back. The recovery wasn't instant. You don't just snap out of months of manipulation overnight. We found a counselor who specialized in helping people leave high control groups. She helped us understand how intelligent, rational people can fall into these situations. It's not about intelligence, she explained. It's about human vulnerability and sophisticated manipulation techniques. The hardest part was dealing with the shame. My husband could barely look at our bank statements or talk to old friends. He kept asking himself how he could have fallen for it all. The counselor helped him see that shame only serves the manipulators. It keeps people silent and isolated. We started rebuilding our life together, piece by piece. First came the practical things. We closed our joint accounts and opened new ones. We changed our phone numbers to stop the constant calls from church members. We rearranged our house, taking down the church symbols and putting our family photos back up. The emotional rebuilding took longer. We had to relearn how to talk to each other normally, without the church's scripted responses. We had to rebuild trust, not just in each other, but in our own judgment. We started small, watching TV together again, cooking meals, taking walks in our neighborhood. Our turning point came during a simple moment about 3 months after the retreat. We were doing dishes together, something we'd done thousands of times before, and I made some silly joke about the soap bubbles. He laughed, a real, spontaneous laugh, then suddenly stopped, looking surprised at himself. It was like hearing a favorite song you'd forgotten you knew. The church tried to contact him, of course. They sent letters about spiritual darkness and demonic interference. But each attempt only confirmed what we now knew. Their words were empty, their tactics transparent. We kept all their messages, adding them to the growing file of evidence we'd shared with other families trying to free their loved ones. Slowly, our home came back to life. The silence was replaced by music, laughter, and normal conversations. The stiff meditation cushions were donated, our comfortable couch returned. The strange herbal teas were replaced with our old coffee maker, its morning gurgle once again part of our daily rhythm. Our marriage did change because of that church, just not in the way they intended. We learned how strong we really were, both individually and together. We learned to question things while still maintaining faith in each other. We learned that real spiritual growth doesn't come with a price tag or require isolation from loved ones. Today, we help other couples going through similar situations. Our story has become a roadmap for others, showing that there's a way back from even the darkest manipulation. It's not always easy, and the path isn't straight, but it's possible. Love, real love, proves stronger than any false promise of enlightenment.